Christians are quick to answer most any question with the same three answers: God, Jesus, or the Bible. So if you're ever not listening in Sunday school and they're looking at you, just say one of those three and you normally get away with it. The problem is we take that in to our adulthood and it's quick to answer the same any question, which is go to church, the Bible, Jesus is always the answer. And even though that may be true, Jesus is the answer. What's not true is if you break your arm, Jesus is the answer, a doctor is the answer. And I think the same is true with divorce and trauma. And so the church is not always great at encouraging people to go to issues they deem as theological issues that may really not be theological issues. And so today we're bringing in a special guest to talk all this out. So, and very, very good to see you. Thank you for being here. And you are the expert, so we're going to lean into you to help answer some basic questions that we have today.
Well, thank you, Todd. I appreciate you having me on as a guest. After you guested on my podcast, we get to work together and collaborate and help people get their needs met in some of these emotional and relationship areas.
Well, no, this is great. I trust you on this, and I know you can sometimes ask the same question to multiple people and get different answers. And so obviously, if it's coming out of your mouth, it's your opinion or it's fact, whatever, we'll figure that out, right? But I do want you to be honest of, here's how I feel, but you also can say, well, most people feel this way. Like, I really love your nuance if you have them, but let's just start with this. I'm guilty of this. I interchange the word therapy and counseling. I tell people you need to go get into counseling, and hey, you need therapy. Well, I don't know that nuance. What is the nuance between the two? Help me understand that. Maybe I need to be using the words better and more specific.
Yeah, actually, these days, I don't think there is much of a difference between the terms. However, you may be talking to an audience that's going to be more receptive to one term or the other.
Okay.
So, those who think that they're a little bit more modern and scientifically minded are going to be really comfortable with therapy. I think most of our Gen Z, Gen Alpha, millennials are very comfortable with the term therapy. But
Okay.
if you're talking to perhaps a slightly older audience, or you're talking to people who have a more of a conservative theological stance, they might be more friendly to the term counseling. So
Oh.
it doesn't sound as sciency, and so it seems like it's within the realm of something that a pastor could do. And so
Mm-hmm.
that feels more comfortable. Now, I was just in Starbucks the other day and I overheard, you know how you're in a coffee shop and you overhear this conversation and you're like, I can't not butt in. And so the two ladies were talking about, well, what is pastoral counseling? What is that? How is that different from therapy? And I just had to walk up and say, I'm a Christian therapist and I need to be able to weigh in here. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's great.
And we were talking about there's a couple different fields. There's biblical counseling, there's pastoral counseling. Those are very, for most people, those are going to be interchangeable terms. And then we have psychotherapy, which means that the person that's working with you, the professional that's working with you, has clinical training. Usually, this requires a master's degree or a doctoral degree, and then they have hours and hours of state licensure, exams, and practicum in order to be able to use clinical skills with you that draw from counseling theory, psychology. Now, what I always like to differentiate here is that you can be both a Christian and a scientist, right? I mean,
Ah.
you can have a therapist who has all of the clinical skills that your state jurisdiction has said is helpful for people going through mental illness, relationship problems, trauma, and who also loves Jesus and puts him first in her life.
Oh, I'm going to break that down. I have a lot of questions there, but let me
Yeah.
keep us high.
Okay.
Which one is medication? Like who is allowed to prescribe medication if they believe, and I'm going to word it wrong so you can fix it, like believe that your mental health might need medication versus just discussion? Am I wording that right?
Okay. That's very easy to answer because only somebody who has been to medical school can prescribe medication.
Oh, okay.
So most people, when they're dealing with like your average garden variety depression or anxiety, they're just seeing their family doctor, their general practitioner, primary care person, and that person is prescribing antidepressants or something to help with anxiety or sleep or whatever it might be.
Hmm.
But then there are some of us who have maybe a more complicated situation, like maybe you're pregnant or breastfeeding and still having some mental health issues, or maybe your mood has gone up and down, like within the bipolar spectrum, and you need somebody that's going to be a little bit more tailored to your specific thing, or maybe it's a much worse mental health issue. And so then you're going to want to see a psychiatrist. And a psychiatrist is the person who understands all about mental health and all about medications and won't necessarily do therapy with you. Like for most people in our modern medical system, you're going to have a therapist who you meet with every week or every other week for an hour. And then you might have a psychiatrist who you meet with for 15 minutes every 3 months that prescribes your meds.
This is so helpful for me. This
Okay.
is so helpful. Okay, let's get into biblical and pastoral counseling.
All right.
So I'm going to tell you where I stand, and then that'll help you know how to answer my question. I do believe there are times where you need to go to a pastor and tell them sort of what's going on and maybe get some wisdom from
Mm-hmm.
them,
Mm-hmm.
and some counsel. And I mean that in the general term, counsel. But I'd also say if you have trauma or you're dealing with some complex issues, he has most likely never been trained in those issues. And I'm going to say trauma is one.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I would say, go to a counselor, like go somebody who's trained.
Mm-hmm.
But I also tell people, well, you've got to go to somebody who has a biblical lens, worldview,
Mm-hmm.
in order to do that. And I've heard other people say, no, 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 like counseling is counseling, and there's people who train for that. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or not, their methodologies have nothing to do with their religion. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
well, I feel like they do. So
Yep.
explain a little bit of pastoral counseling, biblical counseling, and then regular counseling. And when do you send who to what?
Yeah. So I think you're right on track that there are some issues in our life that we do need to seek our pastoral guidance, because it's something we really want to know what God has to say about it. We want to know what the scripture has to say about it. And if this person has gone to seminary or Bible college and has led a congregation, like they're going to have some insights about that that the average layperson doesn't have. In the same way, a therapist is going to have more of that, like you said, to ability to deal with trauma or mental illness or complex relationship problems. We also have more time, more of a bandwidth. I mean, yeah, you got to pay us, but you don't got to pay your
Right.
pastor usually.
Not next Thursday. Or, like, hey, my pastor, I can't even get in with my pastor. And I'm like, no,
Right,
I'm bleeding right now.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, pastors don't, in the way that we do church in America, pastors don't tend to have time to do all of the work that they need to do on the executive part of running a church, plus
Hmm.
all of the sermon prep, and also do pastoral counseling. And so they may, at a bigger church, employ a pastor who's specifically over counseling. And that's one way to make that work. But that person's still not going to have the same kind of expertise that he will need to be able to deal with complex trauma, relationship problems, or mental illness. And so that's
Hmm.
when we're going to look for somebody who has had that training. And
Hmm.
what really trips a lot of Christians up is they don't want to go to somebody that they think is like woo woo, or like is going to be against their Christian values.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like this is my sweet spot, right? Because I have the training as the licensed marriage and family therapist, so I had to do all of the counseling and psychology and psychopathology, like all of those classes. But I got my degree at a seminary, so I also had to take hermeneutics and New Testament and Old Testament and theology and all of those classes, and then advanced classes on how to integrate those two.
That's
And
a skill in itself, right?
so what I would say is, if you are suffering from a trauma or a mental illness or a complex relationship problem, and you can't find anybody in your town that is a professing Bible believing Christian that you could see who's also a clinician, you should still go to therapy, even if that person's not a Christian.
Okay.
But if you have the opportunity to find somebody who believes in their heart the way you believe about Jesus and has that clinical skill,
Yeah.
then that you're
That's your
hitting
person.
gold there. Yeah.
Okay. So nuance for me a little bit more of biblical pastoring or biblical counseling versus pastoral counseling. Because to me, I would almost say, isn't that the
Yeah,
same
you know what?
thing?
So my license is marriage and family therapy. And so I'm somebody who actually practices biblical counseling or pastoral counseling might have a more nuanced view of that. But
Okay.
my understanding about that, and I have some stuff on my website about this, that um, you're looking first to the scripture as your guidebook for how to lead the discussion.
Okay.
And so, if the person's coming to you and saying, I'm having this problem with fidelity in my marriage, we're going to first look at what does the scripture say about that? And
Mm-hmm.
how can I understand how to apply that specifically to my situation,
Mm-hmm.
um, based on, how we interpret the scripture. It's almost like, you go to your church and you sit in the sermon on Sunday mornings, and your pastor is expositing the scripture for you or helping you find application points for the scripture, but he's doing it in a large group setting, right? It's like they're kind of general for everybody. But if
Mm-hmm.
you were able to meet one-on-one in an office with somebody and say, this is my situation and this is the scripture, how do I figure out how this scripture applies to my situation?
Yeah.
Then that would be more of like a pastoral or biblical counseling.
I like that. I would say the easy go-to argument I have is if you don't go to somebody who's trained, then what you have is, hey, pastor, I'm feeling very anxious. Well, the pastor will be like, well, here are the 5 verses that the Bible tells us not to be anxious.
Mm-hmm.
See you later. Go memorize those. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. That's biblical counseling in the fact that it's in the Bible, but that's not getting to the root. Like, what's causing you anxious? What
Mm-hmm.
childhood issue or what trauma, whatever, all the things that you deal with.
Yeah.
Pastors aren't trained for that. And they may be trained in a biblical worldview, but that's not a practical worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Am I right there? Am I missing something?
Yeah, and I think those of us who have had some but maybe some bad experiences with that can be a little bit more jaded towards that, because I'm a sola scriptura kind of person, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
do believe that the Bible is sufficient, but we need to treat the Bible as being there for what it's really there for, and not asking it to answer questions that the original writers never even asked of it, right?
That's exactly right. And that's what happens sometimes. I think we put some blanket statements like, well, here's a verse, so we're going to apply it to this. Like, no, but this
Mm-hmm.
is a nuanced
Yeah,
situation, and you may could take a biblical principle over it,
yeah,
but it doesn't mean that that is a literal verse of,
right.
here's your answer, take 2 verses,
Like
see me in the morning. That's
like
not, it
if
doesn't
I
work
if I ask the Bible, how much screen time should I give my children? Like the
out
Bible's
there.
not going to respond to that, but the Bible is going to tell me, like, how do I be a parent that honors God?
That's
You
right.
know?
That's 100% right. I think it was Chuck Swindoll. He says, the Bible is a lot like street signs. There's some that say stop, and some to say curve ahead. It didn't say stop, didn't say go. It just said be aware, be
Right.
aware. And sometimes we take the be awares as literal. The
Yeah.
Pharisees certainly did. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
well, if saying sex is bad, then let's don't dance either. Well, no one told you not to dance. So we've established that pastors, some pastors are more going to be more equipped to counsel. Some would probably tell you the Bible has all the answers. I would say the Bible has all the answers for what it has the answers for, and it's
Mm-hmm.
silent in other areas, and it's very forgiving in the fact of, well, you go figure that out. Like God didn't. I mean, I even thought the other day, like, who had the first twins? Who had the first triplets? Like, God didn't explain that to Eve, probably. I don't know. We don't know if he did or he didn't, but God allows us to figure a lot of things out on our own. It doesn't mean he has a verse for that.
Yeah.
And same with trauma, divorce trauma, and all that. There's not a lot of specifics to it, but it doesn't mean that we haven't gathered a lot of data and information that helps us navigate those things with a biblical lens. And it's totally okay for people to go to therapy. I guess I worry there's a lot of pastors who would just say the Bible is sufficient, and their interpretation of sufficient is different than what I believe that sufficient means.
Right.
And that's probably a whole nother conversation of what does sufficient mean.
Right.
And I would say it's sufficient for what it tells you it's sufficient for. It's not sufficient for everything.
What questions is the text asking? Because it's going to answer those questions.
100%.
But it's not going to answer the questions it didn't ask in the first place.
The Bible is a floodlight, a laser, not a floodlight. And we treat some lasers as a floodlight, and they're not. They're like this specific situation. Okay, so let's talk real quick, if you don't mind, of I'm imagining people call you for crisis more than they call you for the heck of it. So let's pretend everything wasn't crisis. Would you say it's healthy for pre-marriage counseling, marriage counseling, even if you don't have any obvious problems? And then would you say everybody that goes through a divorce needs counseling? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And what's a healthy counseling exercise? Or do we all just call you when we need you like a doctor, and it's like we only come in with a broken arm? How's it work?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to be biased, and I'm going to say that everybody probably needs counseling at some point, because you wouldn't be living life if something didn't go wrong at some point, right?
Facts.
I will also say that I think it's advisable for you to treat your mental and emotional health in the same way you would treat your car. So like this year, we just realized that we completely blew off the 100,000 mile maintenance, and we ended up putting $7,000 into our minivan. Okay.
Right.
So if we had done the maintenance, we might have gotten by with like small, $200 fixes along the way. Mm-hmm. And I think that your mental health is the same way, or your relationship health, emotional health. Like if we're continually having some checkups, we're not going to have the major meltdowns at some point. So that's what I would say in general. Like it's a good practice. It's like you go for your dental cleaning every 6 months. Why don't we have a normal practice of checking in with somebody about our mental health?
And some people will say, well, I do. I have my best friends, and my friends, I talk to them about it. And I would say, yeah, maybe there's a level of healthy living a transparent life with some friends is very healthy.
Yeah.
But they're not trained and licensed.
And humans have lived for thousands of years without having professional therapists. So we have to say there's something for living in community and having people close around you. So that's not nothing. I would encourage you to have friends that you talk through stuff with. But let me respond to your question about premarital. So I trained in a system called SYMBIS. It's Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts. It's you can pay online to be trained in this method so that you have just kind of like a curriculum, kind of like Prepare Enrich, to go through with your premarital couples to make sure they're hitting the marks. When I did this training, they had this beautiful young couple. I think they were about 21. They were both virgins. They didn't have any family baggage. They had never been with any other people, and they were both college graduates, and the future was looking bright. Okay, so this is the demonstration couple that they used, and I looked at it and I was like, well, this system seems pretty easy. And then the very first couple that I got after I trained in that wanted to do premarital counseling, there was a personality disorder. There was some other mental health disorders. There was a drinking problem. There were children from both previous marriages, and there were multiple divorces in the history. And so this was not that beautiful young couple. I mean, they are a beautiful couple, but they weren't like the simple couple. So here's what I would say. If you are like that young couple in the video and there's not a whole lot going on, like go ahead and just do whatever the pastoral premarital counseling is at your church, and you'll probably be fine. Okay. But if you have any of these other traumas or mental health issues or substance abuse issues or relationship baggage, or you're trying to blend a family that already has some children, it might be wise for you to consider hiring a professional counselor that's going to have a little bit more ability to dig in deep with those sticky, messy issues.
Yeah, and I'm going to add something to it, and you can disagree with this, but
Okay.
as I study the Enneagram, I study personality types, I study attachment styles.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you think you've got it all together, if you don't know those things about yourself and they don't know them, you're going to have bumps along the way. Even if that first couple's perfect, there's no such thing as perfect.
Right.
It doesn't exist, and you need to know. And unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
churches, they go to two things. Well, here's the role of a husband, here's the role of a wife, and maybe they'll get into love languages, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's about it. And they don't get into the deep stuff. And I would
Yeah.
say, even if you think you're perfect, I'm not even sure a church is the right place to go for premarital. Maybe a place, but maybe not deep enough.
So I'm sure that some pastors do a better job than others, and so I don't want to blanketly say that premarital counseling in church doesn't work. That's what my husband and I did, and
Yeah.
we were young and stupid and virgins and all of that, when and so that's fine. But I've heard from other people that will say, okay, so did your pastor, like, one of the questions you ask in premarital counseling is about sex, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
did your pastor talk to you about sex? And they said, yeah. They said we shouldn't do that anymore.
Right. Right. That's it. No.
Yeah.
That's your answer. No.
Yeah. I've also had a couple where they weren't interested in stopping sex until their marriage, and the pastor wouldn't counsel them.
Right.
So they don't get
Yep.
any counseling if they're not willing to budge
Right.
it.
And then they move forward. They still get married anyway, and now they don't have the counseling.
Yeah.
And
But
they
no,
move
they
to
come to me.
justice of the peace, yeah, or something. Yeah, yeah. Um, okay, no. Very, very interesting. Okay, so premarital, we're saying if you have known issues, and you got to check yourself. Like everybody, that's a big word. A lot of people don't even know their problems because they numb and they just create the world that adjusts to their problems. So they're like, I'm fine. But an outside person's like, well, then why are you such a recluse? Why do you get angry? Why do you drink? Why, they don't ask themselves that. They just adapt and they create the world they want. And they pick a partner who can tolerate what they want, and they don't even really realize they're not healthy. So I would say everybody needs counseling, period. Premarital, you better go in knowing some stuff if possible. That's going to give your marriage the best chance and to fight for itself, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The next thing is marriage. So,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think? You're married. I'm going to make up this number. 90% of the people who got premarital counseling never go back until they have a reason to go
A
back,
crisis.
a
Yeah.
crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get people who just come in maybe on their second marriage and are like, yeah, I'm not making this mistake. We're going to do the tune-ups. Does that
Mm-hmm.
happen often?
Yeah. I mean, I love when I get somebody that's like, I just feel like we're not communicating well, and this is so funny because 90% of people who come into marriage counseling say it's a communication issue, and so then it's my job to figure out, what does communication issue mean for your particular marriage,
Right. Yeah. Everything's a communication issue, right? Like you're
Yeah, I
communicating
mean,
some way.
it could be about money or sex or children or housework or whatever
That's
the
right.
issue is. But I would love for couples to have a regular practice of going in for, like, let's just clear the air, let's get some new skills, let's learn a different way of communicating, to do that on a regular basis. But the truth is, it's expensive, and you've got
Yeah.
kids, and you've got schedules, and you've got work, and it's not a priority for a lot of couples until they hit a road bump.
So have you ever heard of the book called Eight Dates?
Yeah, Gottman.
Yeah. To me, that's a great exercise. If you can't afford a therapist, go on
Mm-hmm.
these intentional dates. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a well written book, I think. You can disagree, but it's like these are great questions asked on date number 4. They're all themed, right? All 8 are themed. And within each one, they ask really pointed questions that get you communicating.
Yeah.
And when that happens, then now you at least don't have a therapist, but you have somebody who's guiding you to healthy conversations.
Yeah, and maybe some of the answers to those questions will make you feel like, actually, I think we do need a therapist.
That's right,
Like,
because
maybe we
wow,
should prioritize that.
yeah, it's like it knows where to poke, and then
Yeah.
when it hurts, you're like, huh, maybe we may need to
Yeah.
bring a person in the room to help us unpack that.
Yeah. I mean, the author of that, or co-author of that, is the same as John Gottman, and it's the same as this very old version of the Seven Principles of Making Marriage Work,
Okay.
which also has a lot of exercises for you to do with your spouse. The cool thing about the Gottmans is that they have a whole lab up at the University of Washington where they actually have observed thousands and thousands of couples, and they can tell with just micro expressions on your face if you're headed towards divorce or not, based on
It's a
these
science.
things. Yeah. And so, based on the science, they've developed a lot of interventions for couples to use to be able to beat the odds on that.
I so love it. Okay, let's go to the worst part. You go to therapy or you don't while you're married, and you end up getting divorced,
Mm-hmm.
and you're on the other side of it. I feel like so many people blame the other person. Like, oh, well, I only did this because you did that. They're the reactionary. And if the other person was better, then none of this would have happened. Or, oops, I made a mistake, but they didn't forgive me. It's just so quick. No matter what happens, it's the blame game.
Mm-hmm.
And I also believe a lot of people say, well, that relationship failed. How I fix that is going and getting in another healthy relationship. And I
Except there's
scream
a
to
common
people,
denominator there, right?
that's what, right. My whole thing is screaming to somebody that, no, 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 like, what a great time to reset. Like, to me, I can't think of a scenario that somebody who's been through a divorce should not be going to professional counseling. Am I wrong?
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you. And I would say not only the blame game, but also the guilt. Even if I can look and say to somebody and say, look, your husband cheated on you, or I can say, your wife beat you. Like these are literal circumstances. They still feel like guilty for
Right.
putting the kids through it, for not working harder, for not doing something. And so working with people, like a lot of times when I work with somebody, it's like right before the divorce happens, and then
Right.
through the divorce process until they come out and they actually are a healthy person because they've been doing all this work on the other side. Then I release them into the world. And so that's what I would say. If you are facing a divorce and you think that's what's going to be happening, that's a time to get into therapy. If
Yeah.
you've completed a divorce, and we all know how painful and long and drawn out those situations can be,
Mhm.
like you need to be in therapy.
Yeah, I agree. And I would even double down is I think it's very, I don't know, I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth. I think there's times where your friends or they're so needed during divorce. And that's when you lose a whole lot of friends because your
Mm-hmm.
married friends were friends with the marriage, not each one of you. And
Mm-hmm.
they start falling by the wayside. It happens to everybody. It just does. But you need friends for that counseling and that support. But you also, when friends just want you happy, and sometimes they just give you advice to be happy or let you be right. And you need somebody to vomit truth to
Mm-hmm.
that has a sound mind that's not, they don't owe you anything and they can speak truth because you can fire them, but for crying out loud, you can't go to dinner with them like your friends. They have to, they're on your side or else.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's so healthy to have somebody who can speak truth to you.
Mm-hmm.
And most people don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
Most don't.
Yeah.
And I think paying somebody gives that accountability and that consistency to know if I'm going to go talk to my therapist, I don't have to vomit to everybody I see,
Yeah. Well,
which is
Todd, I
dangerous.
remember when you were guesting on my podcast, you mentioned that you have a good solid group of male friends that have been like they're pastors, they're like solid godly guys that have supported you through this.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very rare for
Very,
men in particular, but just for grown-ups in general.
yeah.
And so if you have that, that's great. But as you found out in your process, you needed that and somebody to walk through some of these deeper issues with you. You need both.
Yeah, yeah, great point. I had the best scenario if I had a really wise group of theologians that walked me through it, and I still needed therapy. So if you don't have those people, you definitely need therapy. Yeah, I
Mm,
totally agree. Yeah, men don't tribe well. That's an American thing, I think. I mean, it may be a world thing, but I know it's an American
a
thing.
modern thing.
It's modern, yeah, and it's we bundle things up, and I think men make horrible decisions when they're alone in their apartment. You know what I mean? It's just when you're
Mm-hmm.
alone and there's no accountability and you have all the free time in the world, I think you play mind games and you justify, and
Mm-hmm.
then sometimes you just jump into relationships, whether they're healthy or not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what a time to reset. I'm really big on that with this podcast. Like, I feel like a divorce podcast, I am talking to divorced people, but I don't like talking about divorce as much as I like talking about how do you recover from it. And
Yeah.
I really do believe it is a trauma event that needs
Mm-hmm.
extra help. And
Yeah.
so I would imagine your career there. I don't think there's enough of you, honestly. From what I understand, isn't there a lack of
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
in the whole career? Because no offense, it's exhausting. Like you guys listen to a lot of trouble all day, and it takes a special person
Yeah.
to compartmentalize that. Is that a
Yeah.
good way to say it?
Yeah. It is a compartmentalization. When I'm working with a client, whether it's a trauma or whatever it might be, like I have to put that somewhere in like my professional brain and not identify with it so much on my personal emotional level, because if I do, then I'm not doing my job. And my job, like I really want to serve you if you're sitting on my green couch back here, like I want you to get what you need. And so I have to find a place in my brain where I put that stuff and I look at it like a surgeon versus being like, oh my gosh, me too, I mean,
Right.
sometimes I do share, like, yeah, that's normal. That happens in my marriage too, like,
Right.
and that we call that self disclosure in the therapy field, and you have to
Mhm.
use that with discernment. And I want people to feel like this is a real relationship, but I also have to be able to shut off whatever that is and just focus on how do I help this person in front of me.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so there's a lot of nuances, and I know we can do more podcasts, and we will. So, but for this one, if somebody's listening or to us right now, and they're like, "Okay, y'all have convinced me. I'm gonna go to therapy or at least try it." What do you want them to do? I mean, can someone come to you? Is Zoom a thing? Is
Yeah.
Where would you recommend they go? Like, give some advice to somebody who says, "All right, now I'm interested."
Okay, well, there's one blessing that COVID gave us, which is that almost all therapists now do online sessions. So if you're part of a small town, or if maybe like you're well known in your town and you don't want to see one of the therapists there, like you can see anybody in your state because they'll all be doing it online. Now, there's some of us that want to have that more personal in the office connection. And
Mhm.
so that can be harder to find these days. But the first thing I would ask is, am I planning to pay for my therapy with my insurance or with just cash I have in my pocket?
Okay.
Because that will make a difference. And then if you're planning to use your insurance, then you're just going to need to go on your insurance portal or ask for their list or whatever it is and say who is covered for
Within this
me that I
network.
can afford. And then what I would do is take those names and start Googling them, because you will be able to see on those people's websites if they have websites. If they don't have websites, I'm like, where are you living right now? Okay.
Right.
But if they have websites, you can go on there and you can see a little bit about what they're like as a person, what they value, and you may see hints to know, is this a Christian person? Like,
Mhm.
did they go to a Christian college that I'm familiar with, or did they have like some of them will even use the symbolism like a fish or a dove or something,
Right.
or they might have a Bible verse quoted. You can compare that versus somebody who has like a lotus flower and some rocks stacked up and has like a quote from John Kabat-Zinn or something like that. Like
The
that might
rock
be a
stack.
different philosophy.
Different philosophy. That's hilarious. That is a great indicator of the rock stack. I don't know why. That just means something else.
I've seen that on a lot of therapists' websites, so you will see that. And like I said, if there's any chance for you to see a Bible believing Christian person that's going to put your values first, then do that. And if that is not available because you can't afford it or you can't schedule it or whatever, then still go see somebody. They have some
Well,
skills that will help you.
well, I'll add one more, and it's not that you didn't mean to say it. Pray. The Lord's faithful, and if you just pray for something,
Mm,
you'd be surprised where a check will show up, a person will show up, an opportunity. The Lord literally brought me my person. I
yeah,
wasn't even asking, and He brought
yeah,
them to me.
yeah,
So The Lord
Well,
is
and
a good
let
giver.
me also say this. My most popular episode on the podcast is How to Find a Christian Counselor. It was
Okay.
episode number 3. I released it 3 years ago.
Okay.
And you can find that on the Soul Grit podcast. And I'll walk you through all of these nuances of how to find the person that's going to be the right fit for you between the scheduling and the jurisdiction and the
Yeah.
payment and all of that.
This is perfect. What a great way to end. I will put, if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple, I'll put links in the show notes to that. And on YouTube, I'll make it the video that plays after this so that people
Perfect.
will just go straight to it. So if you're watching this, just click the next button. This is wonderful.
That's cool.
And thank you so much for taking time. I know there's 1,000 other things we could talk about, but we'll end this topic right
Perfect.
here. And then we'll get into some other nuances. You're a wealth of information. I so appreciate you taking time to talk to the audience about this.
All right. I appreciate you, Todd. This was a fun conversation.
Bye. Blessings.